Today we're going to talk about the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. Two movements, one intellectual and one spiritual, which will take place in the midst of England's attempt to regulate its colonies in North America and defend its empire against the French. But before we get into these discussion on the Enlightenment, I want to kind of set the stage for some of the changes that are going to be taking place. Salem witch trials is a popular story. It's been novelized and popularized in movies and books and so forth. We tell it as part of our story because it serves as kind of a benchmark or a landmark to indicate the changes that are getting ready to take place during this time frame. The Salem witch trials kind of represents the final chapter in an old way of thinking based on superstition and paranoia, whereas what's about to happen with the Enlightenment is a shift in thinking to a more a thought process centered more on logic and reason. So Salem witch trials. In a nutshell, basically what we have here is the high point of European superstition and regarding witches and the occult and demons and so forth. And this goes all the way back into the medieval era. Prior to the emergence of Christianity in Europe, most of the people in Europe subscribed to some various traditions and superstitions about witches and demons and monsters and so forth. But when Christianity spreads through Europe, a lot of these ancient superstitions are going to be blended somewhat with Christian traditions. So while most of Europe at this point in the 1600s, all of Europe is fully adherent to Christianity and Christian beliefs and traditions, some of these old superstitions still linger among many people, namely the belief in witches. With the blending that takes place between ancient superstitions and Christianity, witches now are believed to be the agents of Satan, whereas prior to Christianity, witches were just practitioners of the occult. So basically, the Salem witch trials is going to be tied closely to this superstition, this lingering belief in the existence of witches as agents of the devil. It's all going to come to a head when it does in the 1690s because of some other factors that are going to play into this. Salem witch trials takes place for a few months in 1692. In addition to this belief in witchcraft, there were a lot of other social factors that were playing into this. Society in Massachusetts was a little bit anxious and uneasy. Life was kind of uncertain at this point. Keep in mind, this is at the end of our Dominion of New England. They're still trying to reestablish local government at this point, so there's a lot of uncertainty within the community in Massachusetts. Plus, at this point also, Massachusetts had begun to prosper economically to a great extent. Society had begun to shift away from a central focus on spirituality and more of a focus on secular things like business and trade, the material lives rather than their spiritual lives. So social anxiety and this society that's becoming more secular, these were some factors that were playing into this tension that was building up in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. In addition to that, there were a lot of local rivalries, both political and social. Salem town, which was near the coast, was much more established. It was an older community. They've become more prosperous and more wealthy in terms of trade and commerce, whereas Salem Village, which was a little bit further inland, was a more traditional Puritan community. So they had not benefited a lot from the prosperity seen by their neighbors in Salem town. So these local rivalries between more traditional society in Salem Village and a more modern society in Salem town, these are going to feed into this crisis as well. In a nutshell, it all begins in the home of a guy named Samuel Parris Puritan minister in Salem, actually Salem village. His daughter and his nephew, or excuse me, his daughter and his niece, both preteen girls, one day start having fits and hallucinations that some friends and neighbors attribute to witchcraft. Again, here the superstition starting to play a role. In an attempt to question the girls to find out what has happened, of course, the girls, having grown up in this environment where our belief in witchcraft is part of their culture, they accuse two older women in the village of having cast a spell on them. Now, these two women in the community were somewhat social outcasts to begin with, so people in the town already didn't like them, and it was easy for them to believe that these two women were witches. In the process of these accusations, more and more people will be accused of witchcraft, basically because in an attempt to save themselves, some people will just try to deflect the accusation onto someone else. Oh, I'm not the witch. A witch put me under a spell, and she's the witch, or he's the witch. So they'll start accusing other people to try and deflect attention away from themselves. Some people will admit guilt in order to save themselves. Yes, I was practicing witchcraft. I confess. I'm sorry. I realize it was a mistake, but I was under a spell of another witch, that guy down the road, or her. So accusations spread very quickly as people attempt to save themselves. It gets quite out of control. About 150 people, when it's all said and done, are going to be put on trial for witchcraft. Even the governor of Massachusetts, or the governor's wife, in Boston, is going to be accused of witchcraft. So it gets kind of out of control here. Accusations flying all over the place. When it's all said and done, about 20 people are going to be executed for having been found guilty of practicing witchcraft. 19 women and 1 man. And this gender disparity here is going to be pretty much the pattern of this whole ordeal. Most of the 150 people accused were women. And this is just kind of a byproduct of how society views women at this time. Since the dawn of civilization, women have been viewed with suspicion by society. Women have been seen as weaker, and of course, in this case, much more susceptible to evil influences, and so on and so forth. So that's why women are going to be accused more often of witchcraft than the men. In fact, very often it'll play out when they start investigating these people and these accusations. The investigations will turn up all kinds of other things, not necessarily related to witchcraft, but it'll be kind of drawn into the whole story here. For example, they'll be investigating a man and they'll discover that he's been having an affair, cheating on his wife. And when they start to question him about it, he says, well, I would never cheat on my wife. I must have been under the spell of a witch. The woman that you caught me in bed with was a witch, and she had me under some kind of a spell. And everybody's like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. That's the kind of thing that a witch would do. So a lot of these situations, we see personal vendettas and social rivalries starting to play into this. Somebody you've had a grudge against for the past few years, so you accuse them of being a witch, and so on and so forth. But women are going to be the primary victims in this whole ordeal because of the way society views them as being weak and susceptible to the powers of Satan, which of course is not true, but again, this is what people believe during this time. So in the end, these 20 people who will be executed, they were unable to prove to anyone that they were not practicing witchcraft. Again, here the burden of proof lies with the accused and not the accuser. So all that's really needed to bring charges against someone is somebody's rumor, a ghost story, or somebody's accusation. She's a witch, so now we're going to put her on trial, and she must now prove that she's not a witch. And again, this is just the nature of justice during this time period. By the time we get to these executions and the height of this frenzy, a lot of people are going to start to see it for what it is, and it's a panic. It's madness. Some local clergymen will point out that this has just gotten out of control. We're going crazy with this. We're convicting people and sentencing them to death based on what they refer to as spectral evidence, essentially a ghost story. A child's ghost story has sent 20 people to their death. And there's just something that just seems inherently unjust about that. So the dust starts to settle down. People start to step back and see this for what it is. It is just panic. It's fear and panic based on paranoia and superstition. And again, these brave few clergymen that step forward and start to point this out, again, are kind of the heroes of the story. They get people to stop and realize what's going on here. As bottom line here, our takeaway from this story is that in the aftermath of Salem witch trials, the colony of Massachusetts begins to change its laws, especially with rules regarding trial procedures and rules of evidence. We see new laws in Massachusetts stating specifically that hard evidence must be presented in court in order to convict a person of a crime, and that rumors and superstition or spectral evidence is not considered strong enough to warrant any kind of a conviction. So we do see the law changing as a result. Law that's now based more on logic and reason as opposed to old traditional superstitions. And this is our tie-in to the Enlightenment. Because what's happening here at Salem is just kind of a good example of the old ways that are dying out and beginning to give way to a new type of thinking, a more intellectual type of thinking rather than superstition. So, of course, before we get into the Enlightenment, let's take a look here at a couple of illustrations. Here we see some of the women in Salem who are being executed for witchcraft. The preferred method of execution at the time was hanging. It's just the most efficient way to execute criminals at the time. And despite the fact that women were singled out more often than men in this hysteria over witchcraft, the punishments for men are going to be far more brutal than those for women. Basically, what we're looking at here is the one man who was executed for witchcraft in Salem will be crushed to death with a pile of stones. Basically, they sandwich him between two planks and continue piling stones on top of the planks until he's literally crushed to death. So there's the people who are executed for this are going to die very painfully and horribly. But in the end, society as a whole, the Massachusetts Colonial Society and government are going to begin realizing that this is not the way to handle justice. So things will change. Those changes that we see taking place as a result of the Salem witch trials are an indication of a larger change that's taken place throughout British society. A period of time known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is kind of an intellectual movement that began in the scientific community, and this is kind of just a next phase of what we saw taking place during the Renaissance. We saw kind of a scientific and technological revolution taking place in the Renaissance, in the 1400s and 1500s. The Enlightenment is just kind of a natural extension of that process. Here we're going to be focused more on, again, it'll begin in the scientific community with new innovations and new theories proposed by scientists of the time, and that thinking, that approach to science is going to spill over into the study of society as well. So sometimes this period of time is called the Age of Reason, primarily because logic and reason are going to be kind of the big ideas that characterize this Enlightenment movement. Within the scientific community, people like Isaac Newton, who is doing his foundational work in the field of physics at this point, they are suggesting that if we apply logic and reason to a given situation or problem, it will lead inevitably to a more clear understanding of that issue or that problem, and perhaps even a solution. So this Age of Reason, logic and observation are part of the process. We think and we use logic as we observe a given situation in nature or science, and that will yield our understanding of that topic. The concept of rationalism is going to be kind of the most central feature of the Enlightenment period. Rationalism, defined simply, is the firm belief that in the ability of the human mind to solve problems. Traditionally, thinking in Europe centers around destiny, or a course of action that's predetermined either by God or by whatever spiritual forces that people believe in. Essentially, whatever happens to you in life is predetermined. Your destiny or fate determines the course of your life. In the Enlightenment, we see a shift in thinking toward the self, a focus on the individual human beings as having a certain amount of power over their lives. Rational thought, logic, can produce changes within a person's life. We as individuals have the ability to affect our own destinies, in other words. So there's a focus here on the individual, the ability of the individual to solve problems. And this is kind of a big deal because this represents a significant shift in thinking from the previous several millennia. And for most of human history, there was this assumption that destiny or fate determined the course of your life. Here we see people starting to think of themselves as having power over their lives. Like I said, Isaac Newton, doing his foundational work here in this time period, at the risk of turning this into a science lesson, Newton's, as a physicist, he's focused on his theory of universal laws that govern the physical world. So that the entire physical universe is governed by a set of natural laws, particularly with relationship to gravity and the role that it plays in serving as kind of the glue of the universe, keeping the universe intact. So this is where Newton is doing his work. He's using this idea of logic and observation to attempt to explain the natural world. And this really is probably the most fundamental aspect of science throughout human history. Not just science, but philosophy. From the dawn of civilization, humans have attempted to understand the world around them, and in doing so, they've developed many ideas as an attempt to explain the natural world, what they've observed. This scientific revolution and the Enlightenment is just the next step in that process. Newton here is attempting to explain how the universe works based on his laws of motion. Defining the relationship between bodies at motion and bodies at rest, and how those have natural tendencies. At any rate, this idea of natural laws is going to spill over into the philosophical community as well. A British philosopher named John Locke, who was a contemporary of Newton, they're both doing their foundational work around the same time frame. Locke takes this assumption that the universe is governed by natural laws, and he begins applying it to society. If the physical world is governed by a set of natural laws, then maybe human relationships, society itself, might also be governed by a set of natural laws. Humans might have certain inherent or natural rights just by virtue of existing. So this is the argument that Locke is making about humanity. He's taken this idea of applying logic and observation, reasoned rationalism. Basically, if we apply rationalism to society, then Locke is suggesting here that we can solve all the problems of society and government by using this scientific approach. So it's in this this way of thinking that Locke develops his contract theory of government. Believing that all humans are entitled to certain natural rights, life, liberty, and property, as Locke defined them. He develops this contract theory, and just like a contract that you would sign, like say if you were an athlete signing a contract to play for a particular sports team, or a soldier signing a contract to serve his nation, Locke believed that humanity or individual humans, people, had a contract with society. In that, based on the idea that in a natural state or a savage state, the absence of civilization, more or less, Human beings are free to do whatever they want. Whatever it occurs to you at that moment, you are completely free to do that in a state of nature, in a savage state with no civilization, no rules, no laws, no society. You are free to do whatever you want. However, in an organized society, there's a certain amount of these freedoms that are given up. We as individuals, we give up a certain amount of our natural freedom in order to have other freedoms protected by society. So essentially, we are agreeing to abide by the laws of organized society in exchange for society's protection of our most cherished rights, which are, again, according to Locke, life, liberty, and property. So it's a contract. It's a deal you make. Okay, I agree not to go running around doing whatever I want to with total disregard, and in exchange, society agrees to protect my rights of life, liberty, and property. It's a contract. And he calls it the contract theory of government because in Locke's assessment, the essential role of government is to protect the rights of its people. This idea of republicanism is the most succinct statement or expression of that contract theory. And while Locke was the first to articulate the contract theory of government, he didn't invent republicanism. We can look to the ancient Romans for that. The Greeks were more of a democratic society, a pure democratic society, whereas the Romans had developed a republican society, wherein a few people will govern on behalf of the whole of society. And when we use the word republicanism here, I should clarify, we're not talking about the Republican Party. That doesn't exist yet. We're talking about the concept of republican government, wherein a government, any government, derives its authority, its power, from the consent of the people. Basically, the people are the ones who give the government its power by virtue of their consent. And this happens through the voting process. So in a Republican-style government, the government derives its authority from the consent of the governed, or the people. The rule of law is another central feature to Republican government. In the old way of doing things, there was, you might have heard the expression, there's one law for the ruled and one law for the ruler, referring to the absolutist monarchy, where the king answers to no one but God. The king is not subject to the law because he makes the law. And only the people are subject to that law. In a Republican-style government, everyone is subject to the law, including the ruler. So the rule of law is what governs the country, not a person or an individual or a group of people. It's the law that governs. The law rules the nation, not the people. And in this situation, again, republicanism is defined by a government's central responsibility to protect the rights of the people. That's the reason that a government exists. Governments are formed in order to protect the rights, these most sacred rights of the people, to create an organized society. In a natural savage state, your people run around doing whatever they want to. Some people end up victims and others end up more powerful. In an organized society, in theory, everyone's rights are protected by the government. So republicanism, government's authority derived from the consent of the people. Rule of law is what governs the nation, not the rule of individuals. And of course, the primary responsibility of a government is to protect the rights of the people. Now, this is kind of a new thing for Europe at this point. While the idea of republican government is not a new thing, Locke's presentation of this idea is new. It represents a big shift from the way things are. The status quo in Europe is one of absolute monarchy. The king in most countries rules without any consent of anyone. He rules arbitrarily. Things are beginning to change now as a result of this enlightenment. In fact, it's no surprise that the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights that we talked about in our previous session, that takes place right in the midst of this period of the Enlightenment. The Parliament didn't just come up with the idea of sharing power with the king out of nowhere. people like Locke and other Enlightenment philosophers had already been writing about these ideas and things prior to this glorious revolution. So when this moment occurs in English history, this English Bill of Rights, it is the result of this type of thinking. It's worked its way into the houses of government, and people are starting to shift their thinking in ways in regard to how society relates to its government. So it represents a very important shift in thinking. A lot of byproducts of this intellectual shift are going to be a growing interest in education, human progress. If we as humans have the ability to affect our lives and our destinies, then what might we do with that power? How might we change things? We might grow and develop. Yes, I was born a peasant and I'm illiterate and I'm ignorant, but that doesn't mean I have to stay that way. I can learn to read. I can read books and learn a new skill. I can improve my situation and so forth. I have the power to do these things. So education is going to be part of this story as well. We see a lot of schools being founded during this time. Here in America, we'll see that same sort of thing. We'll talk about that here in a second. But ideas of liberty and equality. People are starting to change the way they think about how they relate to their government. There's no longer these assumptions that, okay, the government rules and I am merely subject to that rule and I have no choice in the matter, and that's just the way it is. People start to think of themselves as I have rights. As a human being, I have natural rights, and it's the government's responsibility to protect those rights. So liberty and equality start to become part of the story too. People at the bottom of society want greater freedoms. They want more equality with the people at the top of society. And we'll see those things, those ideas start to become more popular as time goes on. We shape our own events, and the big one here is that this idea of divine right of kings really begins to lose a lot of credibility. It starts in England, so this is where we see our first example of it with our English Bill of Rights. But later on, it's going to spread. It's going to spread to France and other countries in Europe, and we'll see similar changes taking place. It'll spread here to the colonies as well. In fact, when these ideas are spreading to the colonies, we'll see those over time kind of becoming the foundation for the idea that suggests that the colonies should not be ruled by England. And the independence movement that will develop over the next century is going to be derived largely from these new ideas about society and government. When it spreads to France, it'll play out in a much different way. 100 years after this, the late 1700s, we'll see France having its revolution. The people at the bottom of society will rise up and demand equality and liberty. In fact, that was the motto of the French Revolution: liberty and equality. But it's going to play out a lot differently there than it did in England. England, we had the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights. In France, we'll have the French Revolution and a complete upheaval of society. So these Enlightenment ideas are going to spread, but they're going to have a variety of impacts depending on where you are on the map. How does it affect us here in the colonies in our story of early U.S. history? When the Enlightenment ideas finally reach the colonies, it's going to play out in a couple different ways. It'll spread very rapidly because at this time we see already there's a growing interest in education, especially in the New England area. We've already got some universities, colleges. Remember Harvard University, founded in Massachusetts very early on in our story. We'll see additional colleges and universities being founded during this time frame. William and Mary in Virginia in 1693, Yale University in Connecticut in 1701. Again, right in this time when Enlightenment thinking is beginning to spread and influence society. It becomes part of this desire for education. This is going to be one of the ways that Enlightenment ideas spread. Newspapers, by the mid-1700s, there's more than 20 different newspapers being printed and circulated within the 13 colonies in North America. Now, this is a big deal. Prior to this time period, colonies didn't have a whole lot of interaction with each other. Newspapers now are spreading information among these 13 colonies. Something important happens in Massachusetts, they're going to read about it in Virginia and South Carolina. So when the Enlightenment ideas hit the colonies, they're going to spread very rapidly by way of education and the news media. This is going to facilitate a lot more interaction among the colonies. Remember, in the early days, the colonies didn't really communicate much with each other. They were small and isolated. As time goes on, they become more prosperous, and the trade networks that we talked about earlier in the week start to develop. We're going to see a lot of economic connections among the colonies. And here with the Enlightenment, we're going to see a lot of informational and intellectual connections being made as well. And this kind of segues into our next big feature of this era, the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, which takes place in roughly the same era. There's a little bit of a time lag here. The Enlightenment is pretty much in full bloom once the Great Awakening takes place. So there is some overlap. The Enlightenment is not an event that happens and then it's over. It's a process that begins and it carries on throughout our story. Even today, in our modern world, we are still in the process of redefining the way society interacts with itself, the role that government plays in society, and so on and so forth. Ideas of liberty and equality are still debated to this day. So we are still in this process of changing society that began with the Enlightenment. The Great Awakening is going to be more of a spiritual revival. It happens kind of alongside the Enlightenment and partially in response to some of the changes that take place during the Enlightenment. And generally speaking, we can say this about most religious revivals. And they happen periodically. Every few years or so, we see a period of religious revival. And this one is the first one we see in North America. We'll see another Great Awakening take place in the early to mid 1800s. The abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement will both grow out of that Great Awakening. And then later on through U.S. history, we see other periods of religious revival. So it's kind of a cycle. And in most cases, religious revivals take place in response to a significant period of change that has taken place within society. So our Enlightenment intellectual shift that's already begun to take place at this time, we'll see religious revival happening as partially a response to some of those changes. This, like the Enlightenment, is going to be an intercolonial movement. Just like the Enlightenment, it began in England and it's going to spread into the colonies later on. The Great Awakening will do the same thing. It began in England and Scotland, as it's a spiritual and religious revival. It's going to carry over into the colonies a few years later. And this, like the Enlightenment, is going to be one of those things that helps facilitate a lot of interaction among the colonies, with traveling preachers and ministers carrying this revival message throughout the colonies. This is going to serve as another thread that's going to run through all the colonies and help to connect them and create a more common sense of identity. So this is the first big intercolonial movement that we're going to see. Prior to this, there's not a lot of direct interaction or contact among the colonies. When we see the Great Awakening first take root in the colonies, the focus is going to be on basically rekindling people's interest in religion. In the years prior to this, especially in New England, we see economic prosperity tending to draw people away from their spiritual foundations, their spiritual roots. In the beginning, a lot of the New England colonies were founded on the ideas of spiritual community, a religious community. That was the whole reason they came here, was to build a faith-based community centered on their practice of Protestant Christianity. Well, as time goes on and these colonies become prosperous, trade and commerce assume prominent roles in the local economy. it tends to distract people from their spiritual roots. A lot of people, especially the younger generation here in the 1730s, they are more focused on secular issues than spiritual issues. They're running a business. They're a merchant or a trader, or they've got a large farm or whatever, and they're focused more on their prosperity and their daily activities, economic activities, and they've kind of forsaken their faith a little bit. Now they haven't abandoned Christianity wholesale. That's just no longer the central focus of their lives. And a lot of the ministers, Puritan ministers in this area, are concerned about this. So this declining religious fervor is kind of a red flag in these Puritan communities. Several ministers will see this as a call to arms, to take action, to try to change people's minds, get them reoriented toward their spiritual center. A guy named Jonathan Edwards is one of the first people to really take action here in this attempt to bring about spiritual revival in New England. Edwards was a Puritan minister in Massachusetts, and he had noticed over the previous few years that a lot of his congregation had stopped coming to church. There was fewer and fewer younger members of the congregation as well. Some of the old timers still came to church faithfully, but some of the younger members had come less often or quit coming altogether. And Edwards was very concerned about this. So he was trying to figure out a way to get people to come back to church, or in the case of the younger generation, to get them to start coming to church. So he crafts a sermon specifically designed for this purpose. It's entitled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," and this is 1734. We can deduce just from the title that this message is going to be intense. He's trying to create a sense of urgency among his congregants. Basically, in this sermon, he comes right out and says, "You all are sinners. You're drifting away from the church, and God is angry with you. And if you don't make some sort of change, you're all going to end up in hell." And this represents kind of a departure from the traditional Puritan sermon, in that Edwards becomes very impassioned and very animated in his delivery of this sermon. A lot of emotion is displayed here, and typically in Puritan sermons, they're more reverent and they're more reserved, very, very conservative in terms of the way these sermons are delivered. So this is a dramatic departure, and it gets people's attention. And this is exactly what Edwards had intended here. He wanted something to get people's attention, to draw them back to church. So this passionate, animated, emotional sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," it does. It's kind of finger in your face, fire and brimstone sort of sermon here, and he draws people back to church, especially younger generation. A lot of people find this new style of sermon filled with emotion and passion. They find it, for lack of a better term, entertaining, and they come to his sermons just to see him deliver it. So it achieves the goal of getting people to renew their interest in church. And we see this being pretty effective in this area. The downside is that Edwards doesn't spread this message far and wide. This is a very local message. Edwards' sermon is focused only on his congregation, in his community. So this is a very small focus with this particular sermon. Other people, George Whitefield, for example, they're going to take this same type of message on the road. Whitefield was probably the single most popular or well-known minister in this period of religious revival. Whitefield was from England. He had begun his work with revival ministry while he was in England, and he comes to the colonies now to continue spreading this message. Whitefield is going to travel throughout all the 13 colonies in North America, and he's going to carry the same type of animated and passionate, emotional message of revival throughout the colonies. Whitefield, again, he's probably a little bit more charismatic than Edwards. Edwards was speaking to people that he knew, and he felt comfortable, getting a little bit more emotional with them. Whitefield, though, he's speaking primarily to strangers, and he's far more charismatic than Edwards, and this message is going to attract a lot of attention. Everywhere he goes, Whitefield draws a crowd. Sometimes they'll fill up the entire town square with people that have come to hear his sermon. Some cases, if the crowd's too big for the town square, they'll meet outside of town in a field or a pasture. In each case, though, the attention and notoriety that Whitefield draws with his sermons are going to produce a lot of new converts. A lot of money will be collected in the form of donations, which Whitefield will donate to the local town, and we'll see a lot of new churches being built, especially in the South. And we haven't seen this before in the South. Remember, we talked about in the beginning how Southern colonies were formed more or less as commercial ventures. So this sense of community, a faith-based community, was not a big thing in the South. It's not that Southern colonists were anti-Christian or that they had no faith. All of them identified with Protestant Christianity, but it just wasn't the central focus of their lives. That begins to change after Whitefield makes his tour through the colonies. We see a lot of new churches being built, especially in the southern colonies. We see existing congregations growing larger, some entirely new congregations being formed, and again we see a lot of new people, or not new people, but younger people coming out to these revivals, because this new style of preaching, that's heavy with emotion and passion and a lot of animation, this has a great appeal to the younger audience. So we see not just a growth in numbers, but a shift in demographics as well. We see a lot of these congregations being comprised of younger people, younger families, and so forth. It kind of brings us to our next point, the new lights versus old lights. Basically, lights here, they're referring to the light of one's spirit or soul, or so forth. The old lights were the older members of the congregation, people who had stayed faithful to the church their whole lives. They'd never fallen away. These new lights basically are new converts, people who are just coming to church for the first time, or people coming back after a long time of absence. And we see not really a conflict here, but basically a difference of opinion. The old lights, or the traditionalists within, especially within the Puritan community, we see them preferring the more solemn and reverent sermons, as opposed to the new animated and emotional sermons. And these new style of preaching having a greater appeal among younger people. And this is a relationship that we still see in American society today. Pick a town in America, and you can find multiple examples of these churches. Some churches, usually among older members of society, tend to have a more solemn and reverent sermons or style of preaching, whereas churches that are predominantly younger families, younger people, those tend to be more animated, more lively discussions of Christianity. Both versions, they're both preaching the same doctrine, essentially, but it's the manner in which they preach these sermons is what is the big differentiation there. And so again, we see the same sort of dynamic today, and that all kind of begins here in this Great Awakening, this religious revival that's sweeping through the 13 colonies. And of course, I already made the point about how religious is spreading through the South, and this is by the mid 1700s, 1750, 1760 or so. We see religion in the South becoming a more prominent feature of Southern society. Not nearly on the scale as Puritan New England, but much more so than it was before. And taking a look at a couple of illustrations here. Here's George Whitefield preaching to a congregation of people gathered outside of a town. This is no place specifically or in particular, but this artist really illustrates here how Whitefield is really animated during his sermon. Of course his hands raised in the air, this impassioned expression on his face, and we see some of the members of the congregation too. This woman appears to be weeping, and this man is bowed down in reverence. I'm not quite sure what this guy with the pint of beer is supposed to represent. Perhaps the artist was just trying to illustrate the overall enthusiasm for Whitfield's style of preaching. But the bottom line here is that Whitfield is going to be instrumental in spreading religious revival throughout the South. Taking a look at our map here, we can see this is in 1750. We can get a kind of a snapshot of what religious diversity looks like in the 13 colonies. Up in New England here, we see a solid mass of Puritan society. Again here, very little variation here. It's almost strictly or exclusively Puritan congregations here. In New York and Pennsylvania, we see a lot of Lutherans. Lutherans are the branch of Protestants that basically the closest followers of Martin Luther in his original idea of Protestant Christianity. So a lot of people from Germany in Pennsylvania, a lot of people from the Netherlands in New York. So both the Netherlands and Germany are predominantly Lutheran in their practice of Christianity. So no big surprise here that we see Lutherans in great numbers in these two colonies. In our southern colonies, we see, of course, far fewer churches than we see in the north, but most of the South claims adherence to the Anglican Church, which is the British mainstream Protestants. So we see here growing religious diversity in America. This is partially the result of our Great Awakening. You know, the emergence of new churches, and we can see small pockets of religious diversity popping up in the South. Again, that's partly the result of the Great Awakening. And we see more churches being built in the South as well. It never reaches the same density as the New England area. New England will always be far more religious than the southern colonies. But the South is beginning to turn more toward regular practice of religion as part of their culture, as opposed to exclusive focus on economics. So changes are taking place as a result of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. In both of these cases, we're going to see movements that began in England are going to start spreading into the colonies. So again, we're seeing a recurring theme here. Things that happen on the European side of the Atlantic are going to eventually spill over into the North American side of the Atlantic. So our story at this point is still very closely tied to a European story. But as a result of this Great Awakening and the Enlightenment, we see now many more connections between these or among these colonies in North America. So we see more kind of an American identity beginning to emerge here. It's during this time period that the term American is used on a regular basis to refer to British North America. We say, okay, that's in the American economy, or in the American colonies, or in this American religious revival. So the term American is starting to get regular use when referring to these 13 colonies in British North America. So this is part of what helps to create a common thread of identity that begins to connect these 13 colonies, which previously had been on their own, individuals doing their own thing. Now they are beginning to do things together to an extent. Now, I should note that while an American identity is beginning to take shape here, it won't fully coalesce for another 100 years or so. Not until the 1820s do we really see a true American sense of identity, cultural identity, beginning to coalesce and take shape. But here in the early 1700s, we see some very important first steps toward that development of an American identity. Still not real obvious yet. If you go to the colonies, anywhere in the colonies in the early 1700s, it still has a very much a European, specifically a British cultural character. Even though the first inklings of American identity are beginning to take shape, not going to fully coalesce for about another 100 years or so. But the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, both important events that will shape our thinking, that will shape our cultural development, um, especially with regards to ideas about the relationship between society and its government. And I can't overemphasize this. Uh, the ideas that will give rise to the American Patriot movement in the mid 1700s are going to be largely derived from these Enlightenment ideals about Republican government and the government's responsibility to protect the people's rights. It's no surprise that people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, the architects of American style government, are going to be talking about the ideas that they do. The Declaration of Independence, which was largely written by Thomas Jefferson, is almost word for word an expression of John Locke's contract theory of government. So this is no surprise, because Jefferson and Washington and Franklin and many others of our founding fathers, they are growing up in a world that is this Enlightenment world. When the founding fathers are going to school as young boys, they are reading Newton, they're reading Locke, and they're being exposed to these new ideas about enlightened thinking and rationalism. So it's no surprise that when they're grown men and they're ready to take their place in history, they are going to be heavily influenced by what they have learned from these Enlightenment ideas. When we come back on the next session, we're going to talk about several wars for empire that England is going to fight against France to defend not only its territory in Europe, but its territory here in North America as well. So that's where we'll pick it up next time. Until then, take care.